September 2nd, 31 BC. The Mediterranean sun has barely cleared the horizon, and already the air above the Ambracian Gulf smells of pine resin, salt, and something harder to name, the particular tension of men who know that by nightfall, the world will be different. On the water, roughly 500 warships face each other across a narrow stretch of sea near the Greek promontory of Actium. On one side, the combined fleet of two of the most powerful people alive, Marcus Antonius, Rome's greatest general, and Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a woman whose name alone commanded the loyalty of the ancient world's richest kingdom. On the other side, a fleet commanded by a young man named Gaius Octavianus, 22 years older than the republic he claimed to be defending, and cold-eyed enough to know exactly what he was really building. Here is the question that has fascinated historians for 2,000 years. Was Actium a great battle, or was it already over before a single oar hit the water? Was Cleopatra a traitor who fled and doomed Antony, or was she executing a plan that Antony himself had agreed to? And perhaps most unsettling of all, did the Roman Republic actually die at Actium, or had it already been dead for decades, and this was simply the moment someone finally admitted it? Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. This channel exists to tell history as it actually happened. Complicated, surprising, and far more dramatic than any textbook version. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos, and it means a great deal. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand Actium, you have to understand that the Roman Republic was not destroyed in a single day. It was hollowed out over roughly a century, slowly, and then all at once the way a wooden beam rots from the inside, until one morning it simply collapses. The republic that defeated Carthage, that conquered Greece, that built roads across half the known world, that republic ran on a specific set of assumptions. The Senate governed. Elected magistrates held power for fixed terms. No general was supposed to bring his army across the Rubicon River into Italy proper. These were not just laws, they were the architecture of Roman identity. But by the 2nd century BC, that architecture was already under enormous strain. Rome's conquests had created staggering inequality. Small farmers who had served in the legions came home to find their land bought up by wealthy aristocrats running slave-powered estates. The gap between the senatorial class and everyone else widened into something that began to look less like a republic and more like an oligarchy wearing a republic's clothing. Reformers tried to fix it. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, attempted land redistribution in the 130s and 120s BC. Both were killed by political opponents. That detail matters. The Roman Republic had entered a phase where political disagreement was increasingly resolved not through debate, but through violence. Then came the generals, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar. Each one discovered the same terrible truth. In a system this broken, the man who controls the most loyal soldiers controls everything. Sulla actually marched on Rome twice. He became dictator, rewrote the constitution to favor the Senate, and then, in one of history's stranger moments, simply resigned and retired. He apparently believed the old system could be restored. He was wrong. By the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, the Republic was not functioning in any meaningful sense. The Senate was paralyzed by faction. Violence in the streets of Rome was routine. The courts were corrupt. What Caesar did was not create a crisis. He exploited one that had been building for 100 years. Here is the popular myth worth debunking early. Many people imagine the assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BC, as a heroic act of republican salvation, a group of principled senators striking down a tyrant to restore freedom. The reality is considerably messier. Most of the conspirators, including Brutus and Cassius, were not idealistic defenders of liberty in any modern sense. They were men of the senatorial class protecting their own power and status, and their plan had a fatal flaw so obvious it is almost astonishing. They killed Caesar and had absolutely no plan for what came next. No political program, no successor. No way to fill the vacuum they had just created. What followed the assassination was not the restoration of the Republic. It was chaos. And out of that chaos, three men eventually emerged to divide the Roman world between them. The first was Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, a brilliant military commander, charismatic, physically imposing, and deeply loyal to Caesar's memory. He was also, by most historical accounts, a man whose appetites for wine, for spectacle, for the pleasures of power sometimes outran his political judgment. But do not underestimate him. At his best, Antony was one of the most capable military minds of his generation. The second was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a capable administrator and a man of impeccable aristocratic credentials. He would prove to be the least ambitious of the three, which in this particular contest was essentially a fatal character flaw. The third was Gaius Octavianus, 18 years old at the time of Caesar's assassination. Caesar's adopted son and heir, named in his will. He had no military experience, no personal following, and no obvious reason to be taken seriously. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and one of the most formidable political minds of the age, famously said of young Octavian that he should be praised, honored, and then set aside. It is one of the most spectacular miscalculations in recorded history. These three formed the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC, a formal, legally recognized power-sharing arrangement that divided the Roman world between them. It was not a partnership of equals. It was a temporary truce between men who each intended to outlast the others. They began by doing something that still shocks. They published proscription lists, names of political enemies including, notoriously, Cicero himself, who were to be killed and whose property was to be confiscated. Hundreds died. The Republic's greatest voice was silenced. Over the following years, the triumvirate hunted down Caesar's assassins. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian defeated the forces of Brutus and Cassius. Both men took their own lives. The last serious armed resistance to Caesar's heirs was gone, and then the triumvirate began, slowly and inevitably, to fracture. Lepidus was the first to fall. Maneuvered out of real power by Octavian in 36 BC, he was allowed to live but stripped of everything that mattered. He spent the remaining decades of his life in comfortable irrelevance. That left two. Antony had taken the eastern half of the Roman world as his sphere of influence, the wealthiest, most culturally sophisticated half. Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the critical relationship with Egypt. It was in this context that he met Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII was not, as popular culture has sometimes suggested, simply a seductress who distracted a great general from his duties. That version of events was largely invented by Octavian's propaganda machine, and it has proven remarkably durable. The historical reality is that Cleopatra was an extraordinarily capable ruler. She was the first member of her dynasty, the Ptolemies, who had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great, to actually bother learning the Egyptian language. She spoke 9 languages in total, according to the ancient sources. She was a skilled administrator who had kept Egypt stable and prosperous in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. She had previously had a relationship with Julius Caesar, and with Antony she had 3 children. But their alliance was also deeply political. Egypt was the richest state in the ancient world. Its grain fed Rome. Its treasury funded armies. For Antony, Egypt was not just a romantic attachment, it was a strategic necessity. For Cleopatra, Antony was the Roman strongman who could guarantee her dynasty's survival and potentially expand her kingdom. This is important to understand because Octavian understood it perfectly, and he used it. From roughly 37 BC onward, Octavian began a sustained propaganda campaign against Antony, one of the most sophisticated political smear operations in ancient history. He portrayed Antony as a man who had abandoned Roman values, who had fallen under the spell of an Eastern queen, who dressed in foreign clothes, who wanted to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria. He read Antony's will, which Antony had deposited with the Vestal Virgins in Rome, and which Octavian seized and read aloud to the Senate in what was almost certainly an illegal act, and claimed it proved Antony intended to give Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. Whether any of these specific claims were entirely accurate is debated by historians. What is not debated is their effectiveness. Octavian was transforming a civil war between 2 Roman power brokers into something that could be sold to the Roman public as a patriotic defense of Roman civilization against a foreign queen. He formally declared war not on Antony. That would have been awkward since Antony was a Roman citizen and a triumvir, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke of political framing. By 32 BC, the rupture was complete. Antony formally divorced Octavian's sister Octavia, whom he had married as part of an earlier political reconciliation, and declared Cleopatra his queen. Many of his Roman supporters, including 2 consuls, defected to Octavian's side. The war that had been building for years was now inevitable. Both sides spent the winter of 32 to 31 BC massing forces. The scale was enormous. Ancient sources give figures that historians treat with appropriate caution. The numbers in ancient texts are notoriously unreliable, but estimates suggest Antony and Cleopatra commanded somewhere between 500 and 700 ships and perhaps 100,000 infantry. Octavian, through his brilliant admiral Marcus Agrippa, had assembled a comparable fleet and a well-drilled army. The strategic situation, however, had already begun to tilt against Antony before the battle was fought. Agrippa moved first and moved brilliantly. Through the spring and summer of 31 BC, he conducted a series of rapid naval raids along the Greek coast, cutting Antony's supply lines and capturing key ports. Antony's forces, camped on the shores of the Ambracian Gulf near the promontory of Actium, began to suffer. Disease spread through the camp. Desertions increased. Food became scarce. Several of Antony's key commanders, including the experienced General Quintus Dellius, defected to Octavian, taking intelligence with them. Here is one of those details that tends to get lost in the grand narrative. By the time the Battle of Actium was actually fought, Antony's army and fleet had been sitting in deteriorating conditions for months. His soldiers were hungry. His sailors were sick. His strategic options had narrowed dramatically. The battle itself was, in some ways, the result of a siege that Agrippa had already effectively won on land. Antony's war council was divided. Some argued for a land battle, where Roman legions fighting Roman legions might give Antony's superior numbers a better chance. Others, including Cleopatra, argued for a breakout by sea, not necessarily to win the battle outright, but to escape with the fleet and the treasury intact, to fight another day from Egypt. Historians debate what Antony's actual plan was at Actium. The traditional narrative, drawn heavily from sources favorable to Octavian, including Plutarch writing over a century later, portrays it as a catastrophic defeat caused in part by Cleopatra's flight. A more recent reading of the evidence suggests that the breakout was deliberate. Antony intended to fight his way through Octavian's blockade, and Cleopatra's squadron, carrying the Egyptian treasury, was always meant to escape first. The sails that were loaded onto the warships, an unusual detail noted by ancient sources, since warships typically rode into battle and did not use sails, suggest that at least some of the fleet was planning to make a run for it. What is not in dispute is what happened. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, Antony led his fleet out of the Gulf. The battle began in the early afternoon. For hours it was a brutal, grinding naval engagement. Heavy warships ramming and grappling, men fighting hand-to-hand on heaving decks. Antony's ships were larger but slower. Agrippa's were faster and more maneuverable. The fighting was fierce and the outcome was not immediately clear. Then, around midday or early afternoon, the exact timing is uncertain, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships broke through the fighting line and headed south under full sail. The Egyptian treasury was aboard. Antony, seeing her go, transferred to a smaller ship and followed. What happened next is one of the most debated moments in ancient history. According to Plutarch, Antony sat in the prow of the ship for 3 days, his head in his hands, saying nothing. He did not go to Cleopatra. She did not come to him. There was, apparently, a silence between them that speaks to something: grief, recrimination, the specific exhaustion of people who have just watched everything collapse, that even the ancient sources could not fully explain. His fleet, left without its commander, fought on for a time. Then, one by one, the ships surrendered. His army on land, waiting for orders that never came, held out for a week before surrendering to Octavian. The battle was over. The war, for all practical purposes, was over too. But the human drama was not finished. That part was still to come, and it would be among the most extraordinary final acts in ancient history. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. They knew what was coming. Octavian's forces followed at a measured pace. There was no need to hurry. Antony made some attempts to negotiate, to salvage something, to find a way through. Octavian was not interested in negotiation. He was interested in a triumph, the formal Roman military parade in which a victorious general displayed his captives before the Roman people, and the prize he wanted for his triumph was Cleopatra. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's forces entered Egypt. Antony's remaining troops defected almost immediately. Antony, receiving a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, fell on his sword. He did not die immediately. The ancient sources describe a prolonged and painful end, and his final request was to be brought to Cleopatra, where he died in her arms. He was 53 years old. Cleopatra survived him by a matter of days. She met with Octavian and apparently understood immediately that he intended to take her to Rome as a captive, a living trophy for his triumph. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 22 years. She had been the partner of the two most powerful Romans of her generation. She was not going to be displayed in chains before a Roman crowd. On August 12, 30 BC, she died. The ancient sources say she allowed an asp, an Egyptian cobra, to bite her, though some ancient writers doubted this version even at the time. The exact method of her death remains uncertain. What is certain is that it was deliberate, and that it denied Octavian the centerpiece of his planned triumph. It was, in its own way, one final act of sovereignty. Now here is where the story becomes something larger than a military campaign or a political rivalry. Because what came next was not a restoration. It was a transformation. Octavian returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was 32 years old. He had no intention of making Julius Caesar's mistake, ruling openly as a monarch in a culture that despised kings. Instead, he did something far more sophisticated. He dismantled the Republic while preserving its forms. Over the following years, in a series of carefully staged political moves, he handed back his emergency powers to the Senate, and the Senate, packed with his supporters and exhausted by decades of civil war, immediately gave them back with additional honors. He took the title Augustus, meaning the revered one rather than king or dictator. He called himself Princeps, meaning first citizen. He kept the Senate, the consuls, the elections. He kept all the republican machinery running. He just made sure that he controlled it. The system he created, which historians call the Principate, was a monarchy disguised as a republic, and it was, by almost any measure, extraordinarily successful. The period that followed, the Pax Romana, would see roughly 2 centuries of relative peace and stability across an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roads, aqueducts, law codes, cities, the infrastructure of the ancient world was largely built or consolidated under Augustus and his successors. But the Republic was gone. The Senate still met. Consuls were still elected. The forms were preserved with remarkable care. But the substance, the genuine competition for power, the checks and balances, the principle that no single man could dominate the state, that was finished. It had been finished in truth for decades. Actium was not the moment the Republic died. It was the moment the death was acknowledged and the funeral arrangements were made. The consequences rippled outward in ways that shaped the world we still live in. Egypt became a Roman province, but a uniquely personal one. Augustus treated it as essentially his private property, and no senator was allowed to visit without his personal permission. The reason was simple. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's grain supply. It was too important to share. Cleopatra's children by Antony, 3 of them survived, were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, whom he had abandoned. The eldest, Caesarion, the son Cleopatra had claimed was fathered by Julius Caesar, was hunted down and killed. He was 17. The others were spared, and Cleopatra Selene, Antony and Cleopatra's daughter, was eventually married to the king of Mauritania in North Africa. Through her, the bloodline of the Ptolemies continued for another generation. The cultural memory of Actium was shaped almost entirely by the winners. Virgil wrote the Aeneid in Augustus's Rome, embedding the battle into Rome's founding mythology. Actium appears in the divine shield of Aeneas, where it is depicted as a cosmic struggle between Roman order and Eastern chaos. Horace wrote odes celebrating the victory. Livy wrote history under Augustus's watchful eye. The version of events that survived, Antony as a besotted fool, Cleopatra as a scheming temptress, Octavian as the savior of Roman civilization, was, in significant part, the version that Augustus wanted people to believe. This is worth pausing on because it tells us something important about how history works. We are, to a remarkable degree, reading Augustus's version of events. The sources that survived, Plutarch, Dio, Cassius, Suetonius, were writing decades or centuries after the fact, and they were working with material that had been filtered through a political culture in which Augustus had won. The loser's perspective is largely lost. Antony's own writings, Cleopatra's records, almost nothing survives. What we can say is this: the people who fought and died at Actium were not fighting over abstract constitutional principles. They were fighting over power, survival, and the shape of the world. The soldiers on both sides were Romans, or men who had served Rome, and most of them had no particular preference for republic or empire. They wanted a commander who could win, a patron who could protect them, and land when the war was over. Octavian gave them that, and in return, they gave him the world. There is one more detail worth noting, because it is the kind of fact that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. Augustus lived to be 76 years old. He ruled Rome for 44 years after Actium. He outlived virtually every person who had been present at the battle. He outlived his rivals, his allies, most of his family, and several of his chosen successors. When he finally died in 14 AD, the Roman Empire had existed long enough that there were Romans alive who had never known anything else. The Republic was not a living memory. It was history. It was something their grandparents talked about. That is how thoroughly Actium changed the world. Not in a day, but over decades, as the man who won it systematically replaced the old order with something new while insisting, with remarkable persistence, that nothing had changed at all. The legacy of Actium is not simply the end of the Republic or the beginning of the Empire. It is a lesson about how political systems actually transform, not usually through a single dramatic rupture, but through a long accumulation of crises, compromises, and failures, until one day someone with sufficient skill and sufficient ruthlessness steps into the space that has been created and fills it completely. The Roman Republic did not die at Actium. But at Actium, the last person who might have prevented the empire from being born was defeated, and the man who would build that empire in its place sailed home to Rome. What he built would last, in various forms, for another 500 years in the west and nearly 1,500 years in the east, in the form of the Byzantine Empire, which called itself Roman until its final day in 1453. The legal traditions Augustus codified shaped European law for 2 millennia. The calendar reform of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, gave us the months we still use today. The very word emperor in English, in French, in German, in Russian, derives from the Latin imperator, a title that Augustus held. We are, in ways we rarely stop to think about, still living in the long shadow of the morning when 500 ships faced each other off the coast of Greece, and a young man with cold eyes and a genius for political theatre won the ancient world. The question that remains, and it is genuinely worth sitting with, is whether any of it was inevitable. Was there a version of Roman history in which the Republic survived? Or were the structural failures so deep, the inequality so entrenched, the tradition of political violence so normalized that someone was always going to do what Augustus did? Was the Republic, by the time of Actium, something worth saving? Or had it already become a system that served the powerful at the expense of everyone else? And was the Empire, with its relative stability and its professional administration, actually, in some ways, an improvement for the average person living under Roman rule? Historians disagree. They have been disagreeing for 2,000 years. That disagreement is itself a kind of tribute to how much this moment still matters. What do you think was Actium, the inevitable conclusion of a republic that had already failed itself? Or was there a genuine turning point where things could have gone differently? Was Antony's defeat a military failure, a political one, or something more personal, and perhaps most provocatively, was Cleopatra's flight from the battle a betrayal, or the most rational decision available to her? Write your answer in the comments. Genuinely, these are the kinds of questions where the discussion is as interesting as the history itself. If you found this video worth your time, subscribing is the best way to make sure you see the next one. This channel is built on the idea that history told honestly, with its contradictions and uncertainties intact, is more compelling than any simplified version. If that matters to you, we'd love to have you here. In the next video, we're going to follow what happened after Actium, how Augustus built the machinery of the Roman Empire, why a man who had won everything was terrified of losing it, and how the Pax Romana, one of history's longest periods of relative peace, was constructed on foundations that were far more fragile than they appeared. That story is, if anything, stranger than this one. We'll see you there. But before we leave Actium entirely, there is one dimension of this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it may be the most consequential of all. Consider what Actium meant for the hundreds of thousands of ordinary people caught in its wake. Not the generals, not the queens, not the senators calculating their next move in marble corridors. The soldiers who had followed Antony across the eastern Mediterranean for years, who had fought at Philippi and in Parthia and on the shores of Greece. What happened to them? Augustus was shrewd enough to know that 100,000 suddenly unemployed soldiers with military training and nowhere to go was not a stability problem. It was an extinction-level political threat. He solved it the way Roman commanders had always solved it: land grants and cash settlements. Veterans from both sides were settled in colonies across the empire, in Italy, in Gaul, in Spain, in the eastern provinces. Entire towns were displaced to make room for them. The disruption to local communities was enormous and largely invisible in the historical record, because the people displaced were not the kind of people whose experiences got written down. This is one of the quieter consequences of Actium that deserves acknowledgement. The battle reorganized not just the political map of the Roman world, but the physical landscape of the Mediterranean. Where people lived, who owned land, which communities thrived, and which were uprooted, all of this shifted in the years after 31 BC as Augustus settled his veterans and consolidated his grip on the provinces. There is also the question of what Actium meant for the Eastern Mediterranean's relationship with Rome going forward. Under Antony, the eastern provinces had experienced something closer to partnership. Antony had governed with a sensitivity to local traditions and had worked through existing power structures rather than imposing Roman forms wholesale. Cleopatra's Egypt, in particular, had maintained genuine autonomy. Under Augustus, the relationship changed. Egypt was absorbed directly. Client kingdoms across the east were brought under tighter Roman supervision. The cultural negotiation that Antony had practiced was replaced by something more systematically Roman. This is not to romanticize Antony's rule. He was no less capable of brutality when it served his purposes. But the shift after Actium represented a genuine change in how Rome related to the world it governed, and that change shaped the cultural and political development of the Eastern Mediterranean for generations. And then there is the matter of what Actium meant for the idea of Rome itself, for the stories Romans told about who they were and what their civilization represented. Augustus was a builder in every sense. He famously claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The physical transformation of the city was real and dramatic: temples, forums, the great altar of peace, the theatre of Marcellus. But the more important construction was ideological. Augustus rebuilt the Roman self-image from the ground up, weaving together old republican virtues, discipline, piety, simplicity, with the new reality of one-man rule, and presenting the result as a restoration rather than a revolution. The genius of this, and the reason it worked, was that it gave Romans a way to accept what had happened without having to fully confront what had been lost. The Republic had not been abolished, it had been perfected. The long nightmare of civil war had ended. The gods had clearly favored Augustus. Had they not granted him victory at Actium, in the very waters where the god Apollo was said to have his sanctuary? The temple Augustus built to Apollo on the Palatine Hill, overlooking his own house, was not subtle in its symbolism. This is the final, perhaps most enduring legacy of the battle off the Greek coast on that September morning. Actium did not just end a war. It established a template for how power could be seized while appearing to be offered, for how a republic's language could be preserved while its substance was hollowed out, for how a decisive military victory could be transformed into a founding myth. Augustus understood, with a clarity that few leaders in any era have matched, that winning the battle was only the beginning. The harder work was winning the story. He won that too, for 2,000 years.